Hey guys, Derek and
Paula here
from Back to Reality. And if you've been following along for a while now, you'll likely recall that we recently constructed a germination station here in our basement so that we can start growing some of our vegetable seeds indoors this year. Because though we had an amazing harvest last year, probably about 90% of our plants actually came from the nursery as pre-grown seedlings. And while there's absolutely nothing wrong with that, we eventually hope to be as food self-sufficient as possible, and so we're going to have to begin taking part in the process from seed to harvest.
Yeah, so we've been doing a lot of research on how you go about planting seeds inside. And by we, I mean Derek has done a lot of research. And we feel we've pretty much got the process down pat. And so we wanted to put this video together and compile all of our information in one quick and easy video to hopefully save you some time if you decide to do something like this.
So let's get started. Now, before we get into the details of how to start seeds indoors, we should probably start by talking about why you'd even want to. And for that, we'll need to quickly discuss the growing season. The exact dates of the growing season will vary greatly depending on where you're located, but essentially it's just the time of year when the majority of edible plants can be reliably grown outdoors in your part of the world. For instance, in Europe and North America, the main impediment on the growing season is temperature, given that the winter months are simply too cold to grow food outdoors. Whereas in the tropics and the desert regions, they have plenty of heat, but so much in fact that during the dry seasons they lack sufficient fresh water due to evaporation. So, while the growing season often spans the entire year in parts of Spain, it may only last about 4 months, from June to September in northern Canada. Now, over millions of years, native plant species have evolved to thrive in their specific climate conditions. But unfortunately for most of us, what we would consider to be typical garden vegetables aren't likely to be native to our part of the world. And thus, our growing season may not be long enough to allow for their full growth potential and maximized harvests. So for those of us in colder climates, the easiest way to artificially lengthen the growing season is by starting the plants earlier than you could otherwise do outside, using a warm environment, such as a greenhouse or your basement. Okay, so we've got the why covered. Now let's talk about the when. When you should start planting your seeds mostly depends on what you're growing and how much space you have inside. For most of us who are using our basement or a spare bedroom, the best advice is simply to read the back of the seed packet. The seed packet will typically say something like, "Start seeds indoors 2 weeks before the last frost date." And the last frost date is when the average nightly temperature no longer drops below freezing in your area. But how the heck are we supposed to know when our specific last frost date is? Well, it's actually surprisingly easy to figure out online. For instance, the Farmer's Almanac has a handy database that will not only give you your last frost date, but it'll also give you a rough idea of when you should start planting and transplanting common vegetables in your specific area. But it's always best to check the packet anyway. So let's just say that the Farmer's Almanac indicates that your last frost date is May 10th, and your seed packet says to start your seeds indoors 2 weeks earlier. Well, it's really just a matter of counting back 2 weeks on the calendar. Oh yeah, and I mentioned that it depends not only on what you're growing, but also on how much room you have. And that's because technically, if you have good quality soil, adequate lighting, and tons of space, then there's really nothing stopping you from starting your seeds months in advance. But for the vast majority of us, we'd quickly run out of room once our plants got much past the seedling stage. Okay, now that we've got all the background information out of the way, let's get planting. We started off by dumping out a few bags of soil on our nice big table. There are a lot of different soil mixes on the market, but we chose to go with one that is specifically intended for seed starting. In the future, we'll probably want to start mixing our own soil, but for now, this will do just fine. Next, we moistened the soil with some fresh water and then used our hands to ensure that it was thoroughly mixed. The idea here is to end up with soil that is damp to the touch, but not soaking wet. Then, because our soil was rather cool from being stored outside, we warmed it up for a few minutes with the use of our powerful halogen work lights. We could have just left it a little longer in the warm basement, but the lights are a good tip when you're in a hurry. Once everything was ready to go, we quickly scooped some soil into our 72-cell germination trays, shook it around for a bit, and smoothed it out. You don't want to pack the soil too tight, but make sure that all of the cells are filled evenly. Next, we had another quick look at the seed packets to determine how deep to plant our seeds, and then we used a small stick to poke holes in each of the cells at the indicated depth. Once all the holes were poked, we simply dropped in the seeds and covered them gently. Another great tip is to actually drop 2 seeds per hole. That way, if one of them doesn't germinate, there'll always be a backup. And if they both end up growing, then you simply need to pluck one of them out. I know it seems a bit wasteful, but non-viable seeds are surprisingly common, and it's particularly frustrating to end up with a bunch of empty cells later on. Another option is to pre-sprout your seeds before planting them, so that you know that you're only using viable seeds to begin with, but we'll cover that in another video. Once everything was planted, all that was left was to give them another little spritz of water. And if you have them, it's also a good idea to cover the trays with clear plastic domes. Think of these as mini greenhouses, which decrease the loss of moisture due to evaporation and hold in some of the heat from the lights. And speaking of heat, it's actually particularly important because most seeds prefer to germinate in warm soil. In fact, many people place small heat mats under the trays to get things started even quicker. But the mats are a fairly pricey investment and use quite a bit of electricity, so for now, we're hoping the lights and domes keep them warm enough on their own. But we'll let you know. Oh yeah, and don't forget to mark the trays with some type of label so that you know what's been planted where. Because while it might be easy to tell the difference between a small tomato plant and, say, a bean plant, it's much harder to figure out which is your beefsteak tomatoes and which is your tiny Tims, just from the leaves. So finally, we put the trays under our timer-operated grow lights, and that was it.
So there you go.
Now all you gotta do is wait for the darn things to start growing. But it's probably a good idea that you also check on them every day to make sure that they don't dry out. And for those of you with a lot more experience than us, please let us know in the comments how we did. Did we miss any of the steps that you usually follow?
Yeah, and actually let us know what you're growing, because we'd love to hear.
Absolutely. But for now, we'll see you next time.